We're in front of ourselves. Yeah. Yeah. We should center it. Yeah. We should center it. Wait, the other way. Yeah. Should we angle it down? All right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We look good. We do look good. Are you unswitched?
Unswitched.
Switched.
Check 1 2 1 2.
Makaya McCraven. You know what I like, Makaya McCraven? Watching you art direct our live stream right now, because it gives me a sense of the innate producer in you at all times. I mean, maybe not at all times, but you walk into a situation and I just saw you start to produce a little bit.
I mean, I just wanted to look right and get it right for you guys, and do my part of like sitting in the right place.
Yes.
And liking everything to go smoothly.
Yes. The reason I say that is because one of the things I've been thinking about when it comes to you, I'm going to dive in and then we'll work backwards. One of the things I've been thinking about with you that is so striking in your work is that you are walking this beautiful line between spontaneity and improvisation and being in the moment and thinking big picture about how to repurpose and produce that work later on. And the first question that comes to mind when I hear your records is, when you go into the zone of improvisation, are you fully shutting off what this could be or will be later on? Or are you hearing stuff as it's going down and thinking, I'm going to use this later on. I got to remember that thing.
I mean, I don't think I'm ever like fully shutting down one side of me or the other. And often I like to think of kind of improvisation and not necessarily of like trying to go into some special zone or something, but rather relinquish to the moment, and kind of just be fully present now, and sometimes that can be elusive or fade, and other thoughts can come in like, oh, this is really good, I want to use this later. But ultimately the goal is to kind of relinquish to the moment, and I believe that improvisation is an innate part of being in the world and being human and having consciousness and dealing with time rolling by us constantly without ever stopping, just beating on us incessantly, and there's nothing you can do about that except be in the moment and be ready to improvise through all of that, even if we are trying to plan for the future, even if we are thinking big picture, whether that's how to create a healthy life for yourself and your family or whatever. But no matter what, with as history shows us, and as time goes by and things constantly are surprising us in this evolving world, we are all kind of improvising at every moment. And to me, that's kind of what I like about improvising in music in the moment.
Yes. That positions us beautifully to think about why we're having this conversation right now. You are the artist in residence for the Winter Jazz Fest 2025. You have structured this week around various versions of being in the moment. Some of the shows that you're going to put on this weekend are billed as being spontaneous, new creations, improvised, which is in keeping with a long tradition of work that you've been doing. Others are revisiting older work. I don't know when you were booked for this. I imagine it was a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach something like this? Like, what is your process of thinking about what you want to present over the course of multiple days?
Well, I think at first it was like a kind of a challenge, because I'm always like, oh, what could I do? There's so many different ideas, and so sometimes I'm just like drawing some blank and looking to the moment to give me some guidance. For like this, I was talked to my team and the people and musicians around me, and just kind of, I really like to be a team player. And when realizing that this was like a 10-year anniversary of my record In the Moment, as well as a 10-year anniversary of the label International Anthem that kind of first put that record out and helped kind of break uh, me and that sound to the to kind of this later part of my career. Um, that was kind of the thing that really stuck with me, and I was like, oh, okay, this is a time to uh, both revisit some of those styles of performance and approach to creation, as well as like celebrating kind of what has happened and where we are and where I am now, and just having a look back, and it's quite something after all these years to be artist in residence here, especially after, I was trying to think of the first year I ever was at Winter Jazz Fest, but it was definitely around its inception.
Yeah.
And so to be here now as an artist in residence is really cool and special, and to look back at kind of one of the major moments that has helped me get here is really felt like something cool to be able to do at the same time.
So, as you mentioned before we started, you were expecting a crowd, and slowly but surely, our audience is joining us. So, as you say, you're trying to think back the first time you came to Winter Jazz Fest, and you think it's close to the beginning.
2008,
Right.
maybe 7.
Okay, so 2008, 2007, you had recently relocated from Amherst
Mhm.
to Chicago. Before you got to Chicago, you had already grown up in this incredible environment surrounded by musicians, artists, intellectuals. You had realized at some point growing up that it was not cool to say you liked jazz for a while. You started to explore hip hop. You had a really successful band on the East Coast. Eventually, you move to Chicago with all of that history on your back, and you meet Chicago and discover that there is a community of like-minded musicians that is in the Midwest. That's the person who comes to Winter Jazz Fest for the first time. You're in that moment of transition.
I was in that moment. I was um, coming to a whole new city, uh, having to reinvent myself in some ways when I moved to Chicago. I don't say reinvent myself, but like hit the ground. I hit the ground running. I didn't know anybody. I kind of didn't come up in the city as so many of my peers have, and had deep Chicago roots. And I was really meeting a lot of people, and actually having some of my friends here were in New York, and were part of some burgeoning things that were happening here, gave me a good reason to come back, and even bring some musicians from Chicago and be like, hey, I'm the new guy, but look, we can, like, I can go to New York and look, there's this cool thing happening, and like I just could barely maybe get my foot in the door, but we were here.
Yeah.
And that felt special every time I was able to come to New York to do stuff, particularly when I really didn't know many people in Chicago. And that was actually like a kind of like a, hey, I'm cool.
Yeah. Did you feel that there was a particular disposition or sensibility that you found in Chicago that you were able to define that was different from what was happening here when you came here, had been different from what was happening in Amherst?
Absolutely. I mean, in some ways there were some connections in Amherst being this small college town, but having all of these great jazz musicians who like elders, like Yusef Lateef and Archie Shepp and Marion Brown, and these guys that were there, Max Roach, kind of when I was really, really young.
Yeah.
Didn't really have experience with him. I was a little bit older, but he was there when I was quite young, and I got to meet him. And there was a kind of a type of musician and an avant-garde black jazz musician who were living in Amherst, kind of housed by the 5 college community there.
Yeah.
UMass, Amherst College, Smith College, Hampshire College, and Mount Holyoke. And that community, wasn't necessarily far and wide. It was like there were these cats, and there were a lot of musicians that were coming up under them, but it was still a small college town. And the UMass was bringing a lot of Chicago musicians and AACM musicians, and in for different series. There was a Magic Triangle series. and that I remember seeing some of the Chicago musicians like Fred Anderson come through and play before I ever
Hmm.
went to Chicago. So there was a little bit of an understanding that Chicago was out there, but I, being from the East Coast, it wasn't really in the forefront of my mind. But when I moved there and kind of, I felt that there was a like-minded um, type of movement of that was really serious, bigger movement like in Chicago that reminded me of guys like my father
Yeah.
and some of the expat jazz musicians who were living in Paris and some of the more avant-garde legends that um, I, as a young jazz musician, didn't see as what was happening here in New York or what was
Mm.
happening um, in the mainstream jazz market, which is really what I would consider what was happening in New York
Hmm.
as a young musician looking at the mainstream jazz market and seeing kind of my dad's world and the way they were touring and the way they were considered overseas, but not really seeing that as
Represented.
represented here.
Yeah.
And when I moved to Chicago, seeing young musicians that understood that world,
Yeah.
but were young like me and also wanted to play hip hop and house and were just interested in all this different stuff. That was really like, whoa, that was my whoa moment.
When you moved to Chicago, before you moved to Chicago, when you were in Cold Duck Complex working on that band, would you have said, if somebody asked you what kind of music do you play, would you have said, I grew up listening to jazz, I love jazz? Would that have been part of the?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I would. I definitely. I've always been a jazz musician. You know, I think the problem has been with the term and the marketing and the industry side of it,
Yeah.
and how it's considered by the public.
Yeah.
You know, um, so it's never really been an issue with the music or the culture of the genre,
Yeah.
but how its perception.
Yeah.
And so usually, like in those days, if somebody asked me if I was a jazz musician, you know, I'd first probably go like, well, I play all kinds of music, but yeah, like I came up playing jazz and this and that. And just cause I felt like I had to be qualified cause somebody would be like, oh, you play jazz. I don't like that.
Yeah.
And as a young person trying to think of a career, that was a turnoff. Like, I hope they don't just like write me off because I said this word that makes me sound like I'm
Square.
square, which was upsetting
Yeah.
because where I felt like where the music that I came from was as far from square as it could be.
Well, and I've heard you said this to me last time we met, that as a matter of fact, the elders, the jazz elders or improvised music, Black American music musicians that you met were wild. That's how you described. You said these people were wild.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a square, it wasn't a square,
Yeah.
a square community of
Yeah.
people. And yeah, I always kind of felt that was just kind of mislabeling
Yeah.
and something that I was trying to figure out how to parse through myself.
So you talk about getting to Chicago, and part of what we're doing this week is looking back at the 10-year anniversary of In the Moment and also at the beginning of International Anthem. You end up doing a weekly series of gigs. Was it weekly, the residency
Yes,
that
it
you
was
did?
weekly.
In
As many weeks. I mean, I was also already starting to tour a little bit and
Yeah.
travel. So every couple of weeks I'd be
Yeah.
gone for a couple of weeks
Yeah.
or a weekend, but we pretty consistently about for a year and maybe a little bit longer.
And you mostly did this in a club that was in a converted bank vault.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even call it like a club or a music
Uh-huh.
venue. International Anthem, or actually a company that was a sister company, Uncanned Music,
Mhm.
was starting to do these series before the label inception, and they were doing in a lot of lounges and kind of restaurants or kind of like hip spots that were coming up around Chicago that were that had a little bit of money to spend to put some music in their places to kind of do something interesting in their space.
Yeah.
And Uncanned Music was putting a lot of more avant-garde or experimental kind of music programming in these spaces, which was kind of like a mashup, and one of the spaces was called the Bedford, and it was a restaurant and lounge and an old bank, and they converted the old vault with all these copper uh safe deposit boxes. So the whole room was a this beautiful kind of orange copper hue, dimly lit with some couches in there, and you could fit not so many people. And there was often, this was a new space, and the whole place itself was pretty big. And so we would take, we were recording every week, and our engineer David Trano would pipe the sound through the DJ booth so the whole restaurant could hear it. But they were really trying to get their attendance up, and we were trying to bring some people in, and it was sometimes there was some people and sometimes there was very few people, and often we had our audience that was coming up front and not spending too much money, and then you'd have people over there kind of having dinner and being like, what is this weird music in the corner? And that was the weekly.
I like knowing that even if you're playing non-traditional, unusual music, as a jazz musician, there is still a way to get into a bank vault one way or the other. But I also like the idea of you doing that in a vault, because what emerged out of those sessions was another kind of vault, a vault that you took home and went through. The sort of famous line is that you had 48 hours worth of material. And you got it down to 75 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and there's tons of recordings. Every once in a while, I like to go and pull up certain nights from there, and I'll be listening. I'm like, wow, that's really cool. And then that never made the record. Or I was listening to something maybe a few months ago when I was kind of listening back, and I found this whole moment I really liked, and I was like, wow, this is really great. And then I listened for, a few minutes, and then it evolved into a section in a moment that I had turned into a track on the record. And that was kind of a cool thing to revisit the whole improvisation and not just the snippets. And when I was making these records, that was something I wanted to do. I wanted to make the tracks and the beats, and not really present the improvisations and be like, well, the improvisations are to be experienced and to be there for, and these are kind of more little nuggets and things that I can make to recontextualize it for a different type of listening experience. And definitely in the original, in the moment from those vault sessions, I was something I was trying to be conscious of. There are moments where I really wanted to hear some of the banter in the room, or the talking of people talking over the music, and not being there for us, because part of the story is when there's maybe world-class music all around you, there are cats and musicians trying to play gigs all over the place. And sometimes, if it's presented in a certain space, you give them all of your attention. But I mean, I think there's famously, somebody's playing $1 million Stradivarius in the subway and nobody pays attention. Right. And so then to recontextualize that into like something that's more like popular music or like beats or something that was a little more broad in the contemporary space, I was trying to bring people in that room and have this idea. It's like, well, next time we're doing something improvised and more artsy or whatever, like maybe you want to be there too. And now that actually changes somehow these types of concerts nowadays feel. Every time I do something improv, I feel like it doesn't have the same, there's so much more hoopla around everything than, everybody wants something great to happen, where it's like, I like the improv space to be like, hey, we're just going to experience this moment, but who knows, all these great things might happen.
Well, so I started this conversation by asking you if you're able to shut down that part of yourself when you go into the improv space, that part of yourself that's maybe going to go back later on and go through it. But part of what you're saying is it's not only about you now, it's about your audience that's been following you, and they might be expecting something to emerge out of those improvisations.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that also changes the way that I think people experience the entire thing. But it's, I don't have control over everything. And that's also the beauty of improvisation, is that, you also don't have control over the moment, and there's other musicians and other elements that are there to influence us, and that's that allows for, I feel like, things that are outside of my imagination, or outside of what I can prescript is like, what's the greatest thing I can write, or the greatest thing, but now there's room for the unknown, and I think stepping into the unknown is always it's like a deep experience. So you don't know what's going to happen, and there's like, could be good, could be bad. There's all sorts of emotions just in that.
Yes.
And just being in the moment.
Yes, and letting go of the attachment that you might have to what's going to happen.
Yeah.
The process that you describe of going through those recordings and finding the sections that you wanted to turn into tracks is very much like what sort of crate digging beat makers went through originally when they revisited old records. You were working with material that you had generated, but it's basically very related to the process of, of a hip hop producer going through all kinds of old records. You ultimately then applied what you learned with your own recordings to looking at the Blue Note Vault and looking at the Gil Scott-Heron record that you did. What did you take with you from the in the moment experience when you started to work with those kinds of projects?
I mean, kind of on the first part, what you said, just experimenting with my these tracks was because me wanting to take part in what hip hop producers were doing. I first got into production and wanting to sample things, and before I moved to Chicago, and had this whole hobby. Before the Bedford, every gig I had in town, I'm working 5-6 nights a week. I'd come home and be on my computer or like sampler and trying to make beats. And I didn't really feel like I had an outlet for that. As a professional full-time musician, and I was like doing this whole hobby as a beat maker, and
sharing them with people, playing? No,
just making beats and wanting to do that, but then not unknowing where there's an outlet for that, how to do that commercially, like how to sample. That's not like there was right in the crux of
the
legal sampling, legality of sampling. And so, but also I was, as an instrumentalist, I was coming at sampling from a whole other perspective too. I'm like, okay, well, what equipment do I need, and what are techniques of sampling? So all this was like kind of a study and experimentation. And I used to go to, there was these like beat nights at different clubs in Chicago. I used to show up and talk to producers and like try to get to know people and ask them questions about their production. And so like I kind of felt like when I started to apply that to my own recordings was an aha moment. And kind of from there, when I got to get into the Blue Note kind of time, I was trying to apply some of those similar techniques that I was kind of coming across, but then it was just, there was a whole nother level of new ideas and things, and I was just trying to do some different stuff. I came to different kind of walls during the production of that and the Gil Scott-Heron project, where I was kind of now using samples, but also recording more of myself. And it's always, to me, I guess it's always just it's like my record making process has been kind of a process of discovery and trying to figure stuff out.
When people talk about you, because there are so many facets of what you do, I think the word composer falls a little lower on the list than maybe it should sometimes, because you are, you end up writing, even on the Blue Note record, you ended up writing all of these new compositions on the sort of the infrastructure of the original stuff. I mean, you wrote new kind of modified standards or whatever they were. I don't know if you want to say standards, but new repertoire on, and like, where did that enter in your world? The sort of writing melodies and composing.
Well, I think I always wanted to be an artist. inspired by my parents. Both of my parents have their own records. I remember growing up and having vinyls as a kid with both like my mom's face on the front with her group Kalinda, and my dad all his records, and a lot of independently produced records he made. And so my effort as a musician has always had this desire to want to make my own music, you know, and that includes with my time with Cold Duck Complex, and we wrote a lot of the music together as a band, and we all brought our own things in. And through that period, I was also already trying to write music for myself, and then I was trying to make beats for myself, and I was, you know, and then I always wanted to study some piano and bass and different. I was always interested in being a multi-instrumentalist, not because I necessarily really wanted to perform on any other instrument, but I found if I want to lead a band or create my own music as a drummer, you know, then I need a relationship with harmony and melody. And so it was always more comfortable for me to do that on a tactile space, and learning kind of instruments by touch, and maybe from my mother and from some musicians that would be around. And that's where I kind of started making up melodies and finding chords I like, and trying to like wrap my mind around some music theory, and just in the building blocks of composition, and even taking some private composition lessons with a trombonist back home, Ed Byrne, outside of school. Like I was in school and I knew Ed through my father, and he was a great writer and for big band, all this stuff. And I was really wanted to just like learn how to write, you know? And so that's been something I've wanted to do since my early kind of ambitions as a musician. And, you know, making music from sampling is something that I feel like I stumbled upon, you know, from the Bedford, really. Well, I mean, I was trying to make beats, sampling records that I didn't know how to legally sample. But then when I started sampling myself, and that became an avenue for me to write in that way, that kind of like became what I was known for. Even though I'd been writing some tunes and playing tunes with my own group already, and I just hadn't ever really, well, I already did. I had already had a record out.
I wanted to talk to you about that record. I went back and listened to that record today. I had never heard that record before, and it was really interesting to hear what part of your conception was present then and what changed after the Bedford.
You know, it's interesting with that record, Split Decision, you know, it's in the title. It was almost a split decision of making that record. In my mind, I wanted to, you know, I had my ideas as an artist there. I wanted to make this grandiose record with like beats and jazz and composition and odd time signatures and all these things. And then I, through happenstance, through the Chicago music scene, and Nick Eipers, who ran the label Chicago Sessions, who I met, I had this trio record opportunity, and, you know, because I played a trio session at one of his recording classes. And he was like, I would love to record this group. And I hadn't really thought of recording that group. It was something I threw together for that session. And with that opportunity, I was like, okay, well, piano trio record isn't really what I'm like intending for my first record. And, you know, I just kind of put this group together as a trial, and it was working. It was like, do I want to debut myself
in this light?
And that was my split decision. And I wrote that tune in that moment while I was thinking about that. And I was like, well, you know, why hold myself back from anything? And so that was, you know, and then, you know, that brought me to say In the Moment, which I also never really intended as like a concept. And it's just kind of been, like I said, kind of some self-discovery moments through making the records.
I like that you made reference to understanding that as a drummer, and if you're going to put music out as a band leader and as a drummer, you want it to be melodic, and you have to have material, you have to have compositions, because of course the other side of what you do is totally based in rhythm. And you talked about early on wanting to do stuff in odd meter and do sort of challenging rhythms, but one of the things I think that you've been focused on doing is introducing challenging rhythms or odd meters into a dance context, so that you might not even know as a listener what's happening. So I guess the first question for me is, what role was music for dancing playing for you as you were coming up and starting to put music together?
Oh, there was always music in the house,
Yeah.
and there's, dancing in the house from
Yeah.
my grandparents' house in the holidays. But really the odd meter music in a dance context concept is directly comes from my mother.
Yes.
And a lot of people are asking like drums, and my
Yeah.
dad's a drummer and
Yeah.
rhythm, and but this is like came from an Eastern European approach.
Because where's
to
she
rhythm.
from?
She's from Hungary,
Right.
from Budapest. And a lot of music she made was in odd time signature. And actually the early foundations of the band called the Complex, the instrumental band, we first started to play together was backing up my mother for local gigs.
Really?
When I was 13 years old. And she had songs in 7
Yeah.
and in 5, and in 5 come from a different rhythmic perspective, and a 5/8 or a 5/4 and 9. And we were kids, and it was like, okay, play this stuff. And at the same time, in say the early 90s, odd meter jazz was kind of getting really big. And I'm a big fan of like the Dave Holland Quintet, and it was just a lot of the classic jazz 7/8 was all over the place. Brad Meldau. And but there were still like certain things in school and stuff that felt like when you did an odd meter, it was this like math problem, and it was very difficult. And the one of the purposes of playing an odd meter was to prove that you could play an odd meter and show that you were playing at a certain level of prowess, or certain level of intellectual whatever. And when I remember my mom taught us the odd meters, it was always just a rhythm that went along with a dance. And she would explain it without counting, and be like, okay, the 7 is a short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, long. And that was how I learned those things. And I remember thinking about that, thinking about that a lot, and wanting to find more ways to put that into my own sound, put that in my music as part of my approach. And that's where that comes from.
Yeah, I love that. And I was hoping you were going to say that there was a relationship between odd meters and dancing, because I think anyone who has had the experience of watching a group of people dance in an odd meter realizes, oh, this is a popular rhythm. We think of popular rhythm as 4/4 whatever, but that's we're locked in that conception.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different rhythms out there, and I think a lot of our music, it is very rigid, and it's really in 4/4. And even the concept of the strict 7s and stuff, interesting with some of those Hungarian, Bulgarian dances, the 7 is almost, there's like a hop, and it's almost, sometimes it's not exactly perfect. It's also, there's some give and take there, and push and pull, which the body is.
Well, we talked about this I remember asking about this with, I don't know if it is the tune In These Times. There's a tune that's in 22.
It's an 11. I mean, if you want to, you could break it down in a lot of different ways, but it's, ultimately, I think of it similarly to the swing feel, right? Which the swing feel is based on a triplet, in jazz, dang to dang, dang to dang. There's an underlying triplet, but when you write it in Western notation, you write it in 4/4, and the triplet is assumed, right? And so when I think of In These Times, which is using 11 beats per half measure or so, I kind of still think of the song in 4/4, or like a 12/8 kind of feel, but like 4/4 essentially, with 11 11 beat
Yeah.
subdivision.
Yes.
And so, you know, I think saying it's in 11/8 or 22/8 would really not communicate enough to a musician or somebody, you know, but rather this is a feel.
Yeah.
And once we get the feel under our fingers,
Yeah.
then we can apply that to almost any song in
Yes.
4/4. And my composition teacher, I remember, used to say, and this could be controversial with some drummers, but it was like, and definitely in the music recording world, in terms of royalties and stuff, but like a drum beat, you know, is not um in a composition in the same way that a composition is a composition. And there is, and so like you can take the melody and the chords of a tune,
Mhm.
and just like so many modern jazz reinterpretations,
Yeah.
you can put it in 7/8 and you can still recognize the tune.
Yes.
You can do it in 3/4, you can
Yeah.
still recognize the tune. You can put an 11/8 feel, and
Yes.
you know, but the tune itself is a song,
Yes.
and that song is recognizable regardless of the feel that you put underneath it, or even the arrangement, where you can add a different intro or a different outro. Where I find that like a lot of more modern jazz kind of started to move into the spaces of more through
Yes.
composed types of pieces, where without, say, like the intro bass line and the time signature and the hits, you start losing core elements of the composition, you know, which is something that is been a strong idea for me in terms of jazz and the different eras and the moments, where I think the popular days of jazz, say, was very song oriented, where there was a lot of reinterpretations of the jazz standard, and the whole repertoire was around like show tunes and songs that people really knew.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even when the music was expanding and you're playing my favorite things, is such a classic tune from The Sound of Music, where you could put that in a different time section. You could reinterpret it as a hip hop version. You know, I mean, Andre 3000 did
Yes.
do that on a record before he was a jazz musician.
Yeah. Before he was a flute player.
Okay.
I think, well, this opens up a question that we could get lost in about whether or not, as modern popular songwriting has evolved, there are compositions, or certainly not as many, but are there compositions that are as ripe to be reinterpreted as there were? I mean, that was an era that you're talking about where that material was kind of like, I mean, jazz was evolving kind of in concert with those songs. The 32 bar structure was something that was really convenient because so many of those show tunes were written in that format,
which is a recurring form, which
Right.
is a loop.
which is a loop.
It's loop music, which I think through composed music often is not.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that insight that that it's based on something that cycles and cycles
cyclical.
again, and you build on it and you develop.
Just as the swing beat cycles. And to me, this is one of the like truly African natures of the music, is the cyclicalness, the eternal. The music is eternal until you choose it to stop.
Yeah.
You know, it's a loop. I love that too, and that gives it this space to be interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted, which I do think is a difference in kind of the modern approach. Well, which is all evolving now too.
Right. No, I mean, what you describe about modern jazz composition, we could also say about modern popular composition, whereas you used to have two songwriters, let's say, listed at writing a song. Now everybody who contributes an element to a pop song is considered a composer, right? The person who programmed this gets a piece of the track. So it's kind of evolving similarly in pop music.
Which is good for, I think is good for the community of musicians that are out here trying to make a living off of making music. Yeah.
When you talk about how like you take the tune that's in 22, but it's really 11, but really it's in 4, it reminds me that I've heard you also talk about the way you like to communicate with musicians is by singing what you want often.
Singing or playing or you know, or presenting it that way. I mean, sometimes people want charts or
Yeah.
things, and there's a lot of my music I kind of find is relatively simple, but
Yeah.
with maybe a little bit of tricks and turns,
Yeah.
and or maybe it's like it's really easy once you get, you know, the 22/8
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
you know. But
Right. It's super
it's
easy. There's just
super,
one thing about
just
it.
you
It's
just
in
got to get the
22.
main part,
Yeah.
you know. But then the song
Yeah.
itself is just it's a simple song,
Yeah.
you know. It's only a couple chords, the
Yeah.
form's not that complicated. um and so, like, there's some things I don't feel like it necessarily needs to be so written down in the context of how I want to play, and I want fresh ideas, and you know, sometimes when you call like some of whom I consider some of the greatest musicians around,
Yes.
um, and you give them something that's easy to do, like they're too relaxed.
Yeah.
I'd rather everybody be on their toes and be like, he didn't send us to me. What are we gonna do? And I'm like, all right, now I can see what you can
Right.
really do. Okay.
Yeah. You want to put everybody in that same
And I
headspace.
like that space a little
Yeah.
bit. You know, I like some danger in the music. I like some messiness and some just like we don't know what's gonna happen. Something, a left turn happened out of the blue because there was something, and that took us on a tangent. And that to me is that's the beauty of the live space that, you know, you don't get in recorded music.
There's so much to talk about with you, and we have limited time. But the one thing I do want to ask you about is you've described what you discovered in Chicago, and that Chicago had an impact on you. Amherst had an impact on you. Chicago had an impact on you. And I think that place is very key to your development. At the same time, you started to explore working in different parts of the world. And it seemed like that was a real message that you wanted to send, whether or not it was an experiment that you wanted to do, or maybe even a kind of, manifesto message that you wanted to send to the world, that there's something happening all over that's unified and connected. I mean, where did that thinking come from? And
Well, you know, I was born in Paris,
Yeah.
France, and my dad is American jazz musician who moved to Paris when he found his music community out there, you know. And he first went out with Marion Brown, and he went out there and stayed out there and was playing with Sam Rivers big band, and then from there with Archie Shepp for many years, and David Murray, and whole a scene of musicians out there. And that's where he met my mother, who is from Hungary, a Hungarian folk musician who's doing kind of progressive Hungarian folk, and left Hungary and found herself in France, in Paris, and we moved to the States when I was one. And much of my father's career then was going back to Europe and playing in the European market, and with musicians who had deep roots over there. And that really, to me, was an important part of kind of the Amherst kind of Pioneer Valley music community, because so many of those musicians did have roots in going to Europe like that a lot, as so many jazz musicians do.
Yes.
But particularly, you know, guys like Archie Shepp,
yeah.
and David Murray as well, and so when I moved to Chicago and I met some of the like-minded musicians, it kind of reminded me of that community. And later, when, say, In the Moment was had kind of made a splash, and I was starting to tour in Europe, and I was making over there and meeting and seeing the London jazz scene that was like getting a lot of buzz, and there was all these musicians. That really was, it reminded me of kind of this broader world that existed outside of, again, like, say, New York jazz scene, that kind of felt like hard, you know, for me to enter from where I was at, or coming from a different type of mindset, or then the LA jazz scene that was really having a moment too. And so when all these things were kind of happening at the same time, it really brought me to thinking of um, looking not only at the major jazz markets, you know, but broader markets, and like even like a small town like Amherst
Yeah.
could have great musicians, both well known and the people who are around them, and so that kind of is a motivation of mine to go places and meet musicians and find people with different perspectives on the same thing.
Yes.
You know, one of the great things about jazz is that you could go anywhere in the world and call a standard, and you can find some cats that could play. You know, maybe some cities have more cats than others, but that's
Or
been,
play it in a different way, or leaning in a different way.
or they call different tunes.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
you're in a different city, they call different tunes, which is awesome. You know, but the repertoire is broad, and so that's something with my career and actions, or with the platform that I had, I wanted to be able to engage with.
Yeah. You know, there's a part of me that feels that you've played Winter Jazz Fest many times. You came, as you said, for the first time close to the inception of the festival. But over and over again, you talk about how whatever was you were perceiving as the mainstream tendency in the mainstream jazz market, which was New York, you wanted to look for kind of other tributaries, other themes in the music, which I think makes it particularly poignant that you are the artist in residence this year, that you get to bring all of this career, this wealth of experience that you've been putting together over these last 10, 15 years and present it in New York. Obviously, this is a festival that's very open-minded.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I just love that this is where we sort of are able to deliver ourselves at the end of this conversation, because you described coming to New York early on and saying, I don't know if I see myself here or what I want to do in what's happening here.
But you know, here at Winter Jazz Fest maybe feels a little bit different.
Yeah.
And like you know, getting to do the record with Blue Note, that was really a cool experience. But you know, honestly, I never really envisioned myself with a big kind of jazz label or labels at all. I wasn't sure. Like, I saw my father independently releasing records. I saw bands that I looked up to independently releasing records. There wasn't a lot of there weren't a lot of role models for that in the jazz market per se, you know, and it seemed like there was, you go with you get a deal with one of these labels, you know, and that was the way to do it. Something like Winter Jazz Fest always kind of felt like an opportunity to come in and play in different clubs and do cool stuff here in the city, and it felt kind of homegrown. And the people that I've met doing it were homegrown. You know, it really brings me back to Megan Stabile and Revived Alive, and you know, meeting her when she was just starting that, and then till she got her own stage at Winter Jazz Fest, and then was having a Revive stage, and all the things that she was able to do, rest in peace, for the community and the music. And so this, you know, it does feel like this has always been the kind of a homegrown effort, trying to shine light on different artists and diversity of artists, some of which don't have the same opportunities to get platformed in the same way.
Yes. Makaya McCraven, thank you for coming out and joining us in this exploration of improvisation.
Thank you.
You can clap for that, by the way. Speak freely.
Yeah, all right. Hang out.